Welcome, everybody. We are excited to present our program from Women of Adath, about extraordinary women, Jewish women. We have Dr. Anna Urowitz-Freudenstein with us today. Anna is head of the Department of Jewish Thought at Tenenbaum Chat Wallenberg campus. Her students call her UF, but she said that we can call her Anna. She received both her PhD in Midrash and MA in Ancient Judaism from the Jewish Theological Seminary. We're excited to have Anna here. Anna has agreed to answer questions, so if you have any, please put them in the Q&A section. And we'll take a break about halfway through and answer some questions then, so you don't have to hold them to the end. And then we'll break at the end and allow ourselves some time to also answer questions. So sit back and enjoy this session. And Anna, it's all yours.
Okay, I'm on. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. My name is Anna Urowitz-Freudenstein, as was pointed out. I admit to you that I have actually spent the last little few months on Zoom and even teaching on Zoom, as many of us have experienced Zoom over the last little while. This is my first time teaching on a Zoom webinar. It's a slightly different format. And so it's a little bit different for me because it means I don't get to see your faces. It's a very different feeling for me because I enjoy teaching for many reasons. Part of it is connecting with people. So this is a different kind of connecting. So I hope you'll bear with me, and I hope that everything will be clear. The other thing I have to say is I'm very grateful, of course, to the women of Adath and Adath Israel to have me here. One of the nice things, though, usually about teaching in Toronto, having grown up in Toronto and lived most of my life here, is that sometimes when you're in an opportunity like this, it's a nice chance for some Jewish geography, some meeting up with, faces or names of people that I know from different contexts. And so I would assume that that would be true of at least someone out there listening to me, that I would have some kind of connection with someone. And I regret not being able to actually make that connection. So with that, I guess I will get started. So I understand that it adds Israel that there's a new kind of interest in things having to do with all things Jewish women or women in Judaism. And I was happy to be invited to be able to speak about some extraordinary Jewish women. Now, it's a little bit of a challenge because always when you're dealing with a larger group, you don't actually know where everyone is coming from. I've been told that there are people with more background, some people with less background. So I'm going to try to make it accessible for as many as people as possible. Hopefully there'll be new and exciting things for everyone to hear. But of course, I will need to do some catch up, some basics perhaps, as we go along to make sure that we're all on the same page, or in this case, I guess, on the same web page. So again, if I were in a crowd and looking out into people's faces and eyes, I would maybe able to get a bit of a sense as to, if people were with me or not. Since I don't have that today, don't have that luxury today, I will again just move forward, hoping that that most people will get most of it. And of course, as we said, there will be an opportunity for questions. Actually, we're going to give two different opportunities for questions. All right, so I'm going to be speaking the whole time, but I'm going to be speaking with backup of words on the screen in front of me. We're going to be covering a lot of ideas, and so I think that it'll be much more clear and understandable if you can see and read as well as listen. So we'll be working with that. I have a slideshow prepared, and I believe you'll be seeing most of that on your screen and a little shot of my face along the way. So I'm going to go ahead and do that share screen now, and we'll proceed from there. Okay, so here's our title that we came up with when I first spoke to the organizers a number of weeks ago or months. And today, even though our series is concentrating on extraordinary women, in order to talk about the first woman created, as you'll see as we go along, we have to also have some discussion of the first man as well. And we're going to see how that's connected. We're going to be studying we'll see in a minute, we're going to read in the Torah, from the Torah together, about how Eve was created. She's certainly on his side. It's unclear here if Michelangelo thought it was side or rib. All right, so to get to the background, actual text from the Torah, we really have to look at two different verses from the second chapter of Bereshit, of the book of Genesis, that talks about this idea that we're talking about, having to do with this idea of a rib or of a side. So we have this, the psukim. I guess I'm not going to read the Hebrew here out loud, but you're welcome to read it on your own. The important thing is that we need to understand is there is one Hebrew word that is very important here, and namely the word Selah is the singular, or tzlaot in plural, or tzlaotav, I guess his plural, is possessive plural. So the situation here for this creation story of the first woman is that God put the man, again, the word Adam is used here, put him to sleep. While he slept, God took one of his slaot and then closed up the flesh at that spot. And then God fashioned the tsela he had taken from the man into a woman. Again, conventionally understood as rib. We're going to look at it a little bit differently here and see, could this Hebrew word really be translated in different ways? In fact, there are three traditional ways that the word Selah could be translated. The first one is not as widely known, is perhaps a little bit more disturbing for those of us that want to understand a little bit more of equality between men and women, in that perhaps it was a tail. The word Selah represents a tail. And I mean, it certainly makes sense in that it would be an extra piece that the first man would have that men don't have now, and that would be extraneous, not necessary. And so that therefore God could remove it. It wouldn't be we wouldn't notice that it's gone, and that could be fashioned into a woman. I've seen another explanation that also says, of course, I think most mammals, including have tails, except for human beings. So it would also be interesting that if the first man originally had a tail, but no longer does. This, to me, as a woman, is a little bit more problematic in that the tail is behind, is unnecessary, is minor, and I don't know if it's the most proud place for a woman to be, from which a woman could be created. All right. Again, not widely known, but it is from a very legitimate source, from the Talmud. The second one, a rib, very well known, and it is not only found, of course, in Christian texts, in modern Hebrew texts as well, translations, English translations in Jewish texts as well, but it is also in the ancient Midrash. In that same ancient Midrash, though, the same word Selah is that there's another opinion. As we know, our rabbinic literature is filled with multitudes of opinions. And the, I guess, conflicting opinion here is that of the word side. Remember, a rib is a very small piece. A side is much more substantial. Okay, we'll be talking about meanings coming up soon. So this one about the side, even though it's not as well known in our culture, is actually very well known in Jewish thought. It was made most famous probably by our most famous commentator, namely Rashi. He's the one, he brings that opinion in his Torah commentary. And he explains to us why it's a legitimate understanding of the word. He says the exact same word "sela" is used elsewhere in the Bible, in the Tanakh, to mean side. It is never used to mean the word rib. It is more commonly, it is used a few times in the Tanakh to mean side. The example that he brings has to do with the description of the building of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus, where all the architectural discussions happen, and there the side of the building, a whole wall, is referred to by our same word, sela. Okay, so it's not a tiny little piece, inconsequential, it's an entire side of the building. So based on that, it seems like the word side would be a more appropriate translation. Now, of course, we're going to run into problems that we're going to solve based on the Midrash and other ideas about how a whole side of the first person could actually be removed. It sounds like a major surgery. All right, before we get there though, let's look at those two main opinions, that of rib and side. The idea is that actually we don't have to choose. we can accept both, as is true for many different rabbinic types of ideas. It's not just moderns that it can accept both. We have the traditional commentator Radak. He cites both in his commentary to Genesis. And interestingly, you might say, well, this is just a problem of translation. Maybe there was a mistranslation along the way. Don't forget, in Christian culture, at least, the Bible was translated from Greek to Latin to other languages, and sometimes mistranslations did creep in. In this case, though, it seems like that was not true, that in fact, this is inherently an ambiguous word, because we have the Koine Greek, the type of Greek that was used during the time of the, just about right before the year 0, the word Septuagint, the Jewish Greek translation of the Bible at that time called the Septuagint, and the famous ancient historian Josephus, his works, both cite this verse, and they use the word plura in ancient Greek to describe this phenomenon that was happening, the creation of this first woman. And evidently it can be translated successfully as both rib or side. So we can't go back to ancient translations, unfortunately, in this case, to help us out. So once we have kind of left ourselves with the two most common translations, we can step aside for a minute. We're going to try and figure out how this could work. We'll get there in a minute, but I thought we'd step to the side for a minute and look at it a little bit more homiletically to see if we could learn some lessons about how our tradition sees this creation of woman and what it could mean in terms of male and female relationships. What lessons could be learned from it. And I've brought for you, of course, there are many opinions. I've brought for you two that are contradictory, but both from very legitimate traditional sources. The first from Rav Sadia Gaon and the second one from Abarbanel, both traditional rabbis from early medieval and then late medieval periods. So the creation of woman from this sela, from this side, according to Rav Sadia Gaon, he said, well, this was done intentionally. Of course, if God did it, it has great intention behind it. And he said that in his case, actually, it doesn't really matter if it's a side or a rib, but he can learn the same lessons from it. He says it means that since this is the case, it will dictate the future relationship of this Adam and this first woman. It says he says it will it would teach Adam to have mercy on her as one of his own limbs, that she and also will regard him as the source of her life, maybe be beholden to him. He will look after her, though, as one guides a piece of himself, similar to the first point, and though she will follow him the way a limb follows the body. So this doesn't sound to me as if he's talking about side. It sounds like a little bit more like a rib. Either way, though, it's something that was originally Adam's and then is given to the first woman, and this dictates their relationship. To me, this doesn't sound like a egalitarian relationship of equals. Barbanel, interestingly, says he does emphasize the side aspect rather than the rib. And he says, no, we are supposed to learn something very important from her being created from a whole side, namely that she was not created, she was created from that intentionally, not, for instance, from his foot, okay, because then he would look down on her potentially, not though from his head, because then potentially she would lord over him, but rather from his side, so that she would be equal to him. So for a traditional, medieval rabbi, I thought this was quite an enlightened stance, having to do with the relationship of men and women. Now, okay, what's in the time? Good. We're now talking about this idea of Sela and how our understanding of it can inform our understanding of the creation of woman. Really not just the idea of, this first woman, but then this woman who's often taken as a paradigm of all womanhood, and therefore the place of women within Judaism. So we're learning a little bit more. Perhaps we're not surprised. Hopefully we're not surprised that there are different opinions, that perhaps not all of them are as, have to do with, equality of men and women, although we do see some ideas there. We're learning about that, but the idea is that we can also use this same analysis of these same verses to learn more about the creation, not only of woman, but of humanity. In order to do that, we have to look at some other verses. Now, just as an aside, I have to kind of step to the side here and talk a little bit about creation story, or stories, actually. Hopefully many of you who are listening out there recognize that in chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, there's a creation story. And then in chapter 2 of Genesis, there is a different creation story. Some of you might not realize that, because generally in our rabbinic retellings of these stories, in midrashim, in stories, even in, childhood Bible stories that you might have read or that you've read to children in your lives, Jewishly, we tend to push these two stories together and combine them. You might have heard things about men and women being created together. We're going to read that in a moment. And then the idea of separating men and women. You might have heard the idea of being created just by the word of God. You might have heard of other stories about a man being created from the dust of the earth and having God's breath blown into him. These are actually two separate stories. One is in chapter 1 and one is in chapter 2. The second story, the story that we've been talking about now, having to do with the side or the rib, is actually in chapter 2. We haven't been going in order. We are now going to jump back to chapter 1 and see the verse that talks about, after the creation of everything else in the world, light, dark, all the animals, everything else, the end of creation is right before the first Shabbat, is the creation of humankind. And in this case, we have a very, very strange verse in Hebrew. Very important verse, but very strange verse. I'm going to explain to you it's strange. We're going to have to do a little bit of Hebrew grammar. I'm going to spell it out for you on the next page. Don't worry about it. In this particular verse, we have the creation of humankind, and we actually have the distinction between genders. We have the word zahar unekeva, male and female, used differently than ish and isha, the woman and man, as we saw in the previous discussion. In this case, it says, and God created ha-adam. Remember we were using the word Adam before to talk about the first man? Here we have something else. We have the Adam. In Hebrew, a human is an Adam, a Ben Adam. And of course, Adam can be a proper name as well. There are no capital letters in Hebrew, so we don't know if it's a proper name or if it is a description of a human, or perhaps in this case, humankind, as we'll see. So it says, and God created Ha-Adam in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. I'm actually not going to look at the next verse because in the interest of time, if you're a Hebrew speaker, you'll understand the nuance there as well. Instead, I'm going to move on to the next screen. And then we're going to pause in a moment for questions. There's a lot of color here. The ideas here, I wanted to designate which words are in plural and which are in singular here on this screen. And I wanted to show you that, in fact, this sentence is not grammatically correct. Usually, if you start with the singular, you end with the singular. You start with the plural, you end with the plural. And in this case, it seems to be all confused. We have a singular entity, this ha-adam we were talking about before. We have two singular individual genders, male and female. But we have this entity, this Adam, being referred to in the plural. So we have one entity, which should be singular, but we have it referenced in the plural. This is very confusing and difficult to understand. And so we have wonderful midrash to help us understand it. And the answer is something that is interesting, exciting, or disturbing, depending on your perspective, that perhaps this first human being, according to this rabbi, at least in our traditional Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, ancient Midrash, that in fact, this first human was an androgyne. In Hebrew, the Greek word is actually spelled out in Hebrew letters here, androgynos. There's no mistaking that there are both male and female characteristics in this one body of this first entity. And we have, as bizarre as this sounds, it actually helps us with the grammar because it makes it sound like two singulars can exist as a single person, but somehow that might be appropriate for the plural grammar to be used as well. And we also have here two verses from the Tanakh to back up the point. The first one, because it's a very standard thing for Midrash anyway, that there would be verses to reinforce a point. But here, I feel like it's almost necessary because it is a very strange and bizarre concept. So in this particular case, we have a verse that says, back and before you formed me, Ahor v'kedem sartani, from the book of Psalms or Tehillim. It's a very poetic verse. There's often repetition in poetry. In this case, though, it seems like that there are two backs, two backs in one person, which might reinforce somehow two beings almost fused into one. The other thing that reinforces our point, which brings us back to what we were talking about before, has to do with the concept of side. If we look at the next, and that's what the next rabbis bring here at the end of the Midrash, that if one of the sides of this Adam in chapter 2 that we talked about before was removed and then created into woman and formed into woman, that it would make a lot more sense for it to be a whole side that's just gently split apart, sutured up the back, and now we have those two entities who were fused together as one, separated into two. And so that really reinforces the translation of side. It helps us make more sense of this verse. And the rabbis here, even to make the point absolutely clear, bring the same pasuk that we saw, the same verse we saw from the tabernacle before. And they even bring another translation into an other ancient Jewish language of Aramaic to reinforce the idea that it's the side makes more sense here than the rib. Okay, I think we're going to pause for questions. I'm going to put this on the screen though. Please don't ask me about art history. I wish I knew more about it, but I was able to find this study of a later Cubist painting, actually by Marc Chagall, about the creation of Adam and Eve. And here you see his representation, it's not the only one, his representation of how two individuals could be fused together as one. And here we see, I think, a portrait of much more of an equal half-half rather than just a woman coming from a mere rib. Okay, I guess questions.
Anna, so far there are no questions. I think we are following you and holding on to your words. I know I am. It's interesting. Just reminding everyone that if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A and I'll be able to ask Anna when she pauses towards the end. So we can just continue. Okay, so I'm assuming that means I'm not speaking too quickly also, right? No, all good. Wonderful. Okay, so people, don't be shy. I mean, I'm very happy if there aren't questions, and I'm very happy if there are questions either way. So again, just to look at this very interesting painting that I think is probably part of this struggle of our trying to understand what is going on here in this very important story. Okay, the idea is that I wanted to talk about, and we're going to get to the idea of the demoness next. Don't worry, I know that's like sometimes a little bit more like exciting for people if they haven't heard about it yet. But I just want to pause for a minute and think a little bit with you about the idea of creation and the creation story and how important that is for us. As I think for all cultures, really, we have our foundation stories that that mold us. And the concept of the creation of humankind, men and women, really has molded so much of Judaism, and I would argue our modern world as well, which is really, at least in North America, built on a Judeo-Christian ethic. Of course, different commentators have taken this in different directions, but the idea of, the woman as coming second, coming from a small, unnecessary piece, followed by, the later discussion of Eve and the fall from Eden and the snake and that whole story, which we're not doing today, really has molded, many people believe, the idea of women as being secondary in a patriarchal system in which we all live in. So, some of it might exist for biological reasons, philosophical reasons, otherwise, but this story and different interpretations of it has really been used to reinforce some of those ideas about women as being secondary to men. And that's why it's so interesting to me to really emphasize this view, the one that we're seeing on the screen now, which again is not, I don't see any of your faces. So when I see the word feminism, I don't know if that's something that people would applaud or be upset about or be confused about. I'm applauding, by the way, in case you couldn't guess. But it is a, sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a moment. The idea that humankind, that male and female gender were created at the same time, not one first and one second,
But at the same time, in the chapter 1 of our Torah, I think is a very powerful, powerful message, and something that needs to be absolutely remembered. And I'm happy to focus on it here. It's not just, learning this story. It is really so much that has an underpinning of how religion and personal relationships really can be. And I am ecstatic to remind everyone or teach, whichever it is, that this idea exists in our most ancient text. All right, that aside, now we have to figure out what to do next, because I told you there's 2 creation stories, and we can try to mash them together as our ancient rabbis did in different ways. But if we do that, there's a chance, if we did the math, that someone has gone missing. We have this entity that's still on the screen in front of us, one entity that is split into 2. Then in chapter 2, as we talked about, we also have a let me take it back. This entity is on the screen in front of us. Obviously, we don't all look like this today. So we have to assume that at some point this was split into 2. Okay. Then we have chapter 2, where we have another discussion of the man. In that case, I would say it's man, perhaps. And then his side is taken off and is then made into woman. It might be the same entity, in which case we don't have a math problem. One that looks like 2 becomes 2 separate ones. But there's a chance, if we don't blend the stories together quite as well, we might be left with an outsider. We might be left with something or someone here, namely the woman, who is separated off because this, 2-gendered entity doesn't continue to exist. And then afterwards, another side is somehow separated off into Eve, who would become Eve, the first woman. That would leave us with 3. That's a problem because who the heck is the third? Well, that's when our concept of the demoness comes in. And then we turn to the next slide. So as you know, our title of today's talk was The First Man, Woman, and Demoness. This demoness is named Lilith. And I want to tell you her story. There's a little bit more words on this screen than I usually would like to have, but I think it's important to understand this whole story. And we'll see in a minute anyway that there's different versions of the story, but let's get the basics under our belts. So we're going to learn a new story now. This one is not in the Torah. Let's be clear, absolutely not in the Bible. Our earliest source of this story is in a source called here, as I said on the top, the Alphabet of Ben Sira. And we're going to talk soon more about that source. But for now, let me just tell you the story. After the Holy One created the first human being, Adam, he said, "It is not good for Adam to be alone." He created a woman also from the earth and called her Lilith. Okay, now this is the confusing part in terms of where this story comes from. Could this come from the math problem that we talked about before? 2 that became 1, that were 2, that were 1, where's the other one? Or could this be from an extra biblical idea of an other creation that happened during chapter 2 that is not written in chapter 2, having to do with a creation like man, in that man in chapter 2 is is made from the earth, and the breath of God is then blown into him, that perhaps there was a parallel, or not parallel, but immediately after creation that was done of a woman. Okay, again, not in the Bible. But if that were to happen, according to this story, that's what happened. He created a woman also from the earth and called her Lilith. We'll see the word Lilith discussed in a few minutes. For now, if it reminds you of the word Lila, you would, it clearly is related for the word night. And of course, night being a time of, pre-electricity and pre-modern times, of fear perhaps, and of, well, I don't know, white and black, good and evil, that kind of thing. So not good. So we have these two creations. They quarreled immediately. She said, I will not lie below you. And he said, I will not belie you, but above you, for you are fit to be below me and I above you. So there are arguing here about sexual positions. She responded, we are both equal because we both come from the earth. We have the same, we were created out of the same thing. Neither listened to the other. When Lilith realized what was happening, she pronounced the ineffable name of God and flew off into the air. We're going to see that magic is a very important aspect of this story, and we're seeing that here. Adam arose in prayer before the Creator, saying, the woman you gave me has fled from me, and I'm supposed to have someone with me. What's going on? I'm all alone now. Immediately, the Holy One sent 3 angels after her. The Holy One said to Adam, if she wants to return, all the better. If not, she'll have to accept that 100 of her children will die every day. Interesting that even Lilith has free will here. And we're going to have to learn more about this concept about 100 of her children will die every day. How does she have children? What is this about? But we'll see that unfortunately the idea of death of children is very closely associated with Lilith. When the angels went after her, they finally located her in the sea. They told her what God had said, and she said no, she would not return. She would accept that punishment and maintain her independence. So I just wanted to, this is the exact same slide again, but in this case, I've just highlighted some of these concepts, attributes perhaps of this Lilith that we'll see play out as her story continues in Jewish history. So this idea of quarreling immediately, okay, she's not always an agreeable person. She's not just going to acquiesce to what the man says. She talks about her being equal to man. She, again, this has to do with the quarreling, and she is able to use magic, some kind of holy magic, to fly off into the air. So we have a magical element here, and we have her asserting her independence and not wanting to return. So we're talking about this idea of Lilith. We're talking about it as a person, as a name, a proper name. We're talking about Adam before as being a proper name, but also the word for humanity. Lilith, coincidentally, has a similar idea behind it in that it is a proper name, but it's also apparently a category of ancient Near Eastern demons that existed in male form as well, called a lily, apparently in a male form, Lilith in a female form. And they existed in other ancient Near Eastern religions or cultures, excuse me, not religions, but cultures of the time in the area of the Mediterranean, actually, I guess, east of the Mediterranean, like in ancient Babylonia and what would be modern day Iran in Iraq. And these Liliths or demons, specific types of demons, are always known as being involved somehow in seducers, having something to do with inappropriate sexual issues, and also then slayers of children. So very, very dangerous demons. The word itself is actually found once in the Tanakh, in the book of Isaiah. In a poetic way. We don't really understand what it means, but I don't know if it's actually a demon there or something else that would be, outside of kind of normal society. It is a dweller in waste places. Now, we know about these Liliths, though, from other cultures, because we actually have material remains that have been discovered by archaeologists that talk about them. And the material remains are actually something called incantation bowls. And incantation bowls were bowls that were used by lay people or ritual specialists from everyone in that region, Jews, Manichaeans, Christians, and pagan communities. They were bowls that they made out of clay, and they were inscribed with incantations, spells, and drawings, in this case, of bound Liliths or demons. The idea is, as I mentioned before, when we talked about Lilith, we're entering into the realm of magic. Generally, we like to believe that Jews are Jews and that they don't believe in magic or in idolatry, which really magic could be an example of idolatry. However, I think we all know the Jews, even today, can be superstitious, especially in horrible times like of pandemics. And that alongside of our religion, our formal rabbinic religion, there has always been a aspect of folk religion or magic that has existed at the same time, going all the way back to ancient times. Some of this kind of crosses the line, and the prophets and then the rabbis speak up against it, saying that it actually is idolatry and forbidden. And sometimes it just continues to go on, usually in the home, often related to women, actually in the private sphere, and often related to issues that we would consider to be medical issues today. Remember, we're talking about in ancient times, and so, there was no such thing as medical science as we have today, but unfortunately, people still got sick and died, and babies that we're talking about now died as well. And people looked for answers and for protection for the people in their lives who were suffering, and for people who were helpless in their society, in their homes, in their families. And so if they felt it would help their families, they sought out rituals to do so that were perhaps outside the realm of what would be the normal conventional religion. And that's where magic came into play. Again, we know Jews did this, ancient Jews, because of archaeological remains. And we know the Jews continue to do this, and they did throughout the times. People are familiar, of course, with the red string that people wear. I don't have one. That to ward away the evil eye. And people are familiar perhaps with tying a red ribbon around a baby's crib. A similar thing to ward away these kind of evil demons. So in ancient times, they even used artifacts, bowls with inscriptions on them. All right. So this is the concept of Lilith. It existed in the whole region at the time, including Jews. But it's not only ancient. All right, it goes up to even modern times as we'll see. I just want to get back to the idea again here of children. The idea about of babies, really, of unfortunately, the idea of the different ending of the Lilith story. There was this kind of weird idea that I read to you before about a punishment for Lilith is that 100 of her babies would be killed on a regular basis for refusing to come back to Adam. And somehow this morphed into a different idea about her having control over babies' lives, or have the ability to have control over babies' survival rates, as we know, unfortunately, again, in pre-modern times, even today in some parts of the world, infant mortality is sometimes a little bit iffy. And so people were always very frightened, that their babies would not survive. And so this idea that Lilith could swoop into the home and that she would have the power to take away the baby based on these stories certainly existed. People knew this story. But there was a workaround, according to this version, of an amulet that people could have amulets written, which would be a kind of a more modern version of those incantation bowls I talked about before, that would be inscribed with different formula, angels' names, etc., in order to protect from Lilith. And for instance, there's a citation here. It says there's a mystical book called Sefer Raziel, named for an angel, written in 1700, that gives actually concrete instructions with drawings about how to make such an amulet. But of course, this idea probably did not need to be preserved in books. It probably was preserved as part of a folk religion that was probably passed down, usually from mother to daughter. And they knew how to make these amulets. You can find them in Jewish museums today. I was able to find this one on the internet. of, I forget, I think this is from a Jewish museum, I believe in California. I don't think it's worth it to click on it now, but this one is from 18th century Iran. So still trying to protect a newborn baby from Lilith coming and taking it and killing it. So I want to talk, this very interesting idea about Lilith that I've introduced to you is actually problematic. Okay, I've got a few minutes to go. I've got a lot to do here. I mentioned before, it comes from this source called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. And it's a source, according to modern academics, that is not a legitimate rabbinic source. It sounds very rabbinic in the name of it, right? It sounds very legit, but in fact, it is, most people consider it not to be. It is a Hebrew work written in the Middle Ages, but it is filled with ideas and stories that are satirical and even heretical. And so much so that there are different versions of it because it had to be censored, self-censored by Jews over the centuries. It includes pornographic elements as well as derogatory descriptions of biblical figures like King Solomon or Joshua. And it does contain motifs from international folklore that are then adapted and sound very satirical. So modern historians disagree as to whether it was intended to be a satire or some kind of an expose, or maybe even anti-Christian or anti-Karaite. But the thing is that it is not seen by any academic or any historian as being a book that would be used for, legitimate Torah study. It seems to be almost the opposite. So the question here is, what does the story of Lilith, if this is the source of the story of Lilith, what kind of importance could this story of Lilith have in our lives? Obviously, the story of Lilith did persist because we know about these amulets and folk traditions that continued and people were frightened of her or what she represented, this demoness. So the concept existed. The question is, how legitimate is this concept? There's also another question, does it matter about the legitimacy? If people, felt it was an important part of their lives in order to try to, I would argue, try to understand, why do bad things happen to good people or babies, and how we can help ourselves be protected from such a thing. So we have a problem with the legitimacy of this story. But the twist for our ending is that by the 1970s, the story actually had been reproduced in Hebrew and in English and began to be adopted by second wave Jewish feminists. And they saw elements of Lilith's story. They ignored the part about the baby killer. And they instead emphasized the aspect of the independence and the desire for equality. And they took her story and they reinvented it or reappropriated it and decided to understand it as something positive. Now, you've probably heard the name Lilith because continues to be a Jewish magazine called Lilith. You see here, I've given you a picture of actually the first one and then the current edition. And then underneath there, really, of course, now it lives on the web as well. So that's what their website looks like. And the idea is here that this name was very consciously chosen in the early 1970s or mid 1970s by the people who started this magazine to try to emphasize a tradition or reinvent a tradition that there's a hint of in Judaism, to emphasize the independence and the equality of women within a medieval tradition within Judaism that maybe has at least some connections to more ancient times, but really by changing a negative into a positive, which is an interesting concept to think about in terms of symbols. Of course, not everyone would agree that that's legitimate, but for some people that could be very powerful. It depends on your perspective. Finally, the interesting thing about the term Lilith is that somehow it's really taken off in popular culture. The name appears apparently in like different superhero things and different fantasy novels. If you speak to anyone in your life that's interested in such a thing, apparently the name as a powerful, independent woman has taken off even in non-Jewish circles. And just something as simple as looking up the Wikipedia entry for Lilith in popular culture. Again, I don't know how legit this is, but in the whole world of anime, manga, comics, video games, fantasy novels, apparently this concept is continuing to grow in very different ways, even outside of the Jewish world. So I'm just scrolling down more and more and more. So it's an idea that's out there. And again, not simple, just like a lot of things in life. But I wanted to be able to introduce to you where it came from and how and if and why it's related to our tradition, and again, to our foundation stories about the creation of men and women in Judaism. Okay, so I'm going to stop share for now. There we go. And Carol, are there any questions?
There are. We have a couple of questions. Some of them fall into the same category.
Okay.
And one of them was about Ben Shira that you, Sarah, that you already just answered. So I'm
Okay.
going to ask the question. The
Sure.
word Tsela is
Right.
used to describe the sides of a triangle. Could this apply to the interpretation of the creation of Ha-Adam, triangle of God, male and female, or triangle of Adam, Eve, and Lilith?
So we're talking modern Hebrew and geometry here, it sounds like.
Yeah, maybe. There was a math question later on.
There's a math question. Okay, so I think Sela, I don't know enough about, I do know modern Hebrew, but not enough about technical terminology when it comes to geometry. I do know, though, that the ancient term Sela that was used in the verse that was cited there by Rashi and even in the Midrash refers to the tabernacle, and that would have been a rectangular formation. So I'm a little bit more comfortable with a rectangle rather than a triangle. Perhaps I'm a little bit too influenced, again, as I said, living in a Judeo-Christian culture. When I hear triangle, I hear Trinity, and I'm not as comfortable with that. But certainly, I mean, there are beautiful midrashim about man, about, God, man, and woman coming together in a creative process in terms of, procreation, in terms of how each child born to a man and woman would be considered, miraculous, and that God is somehow involved with that. So I like that triangle. But the Lilith stories that I know of are before the creation of Eve. So she's out of the picture before Eve comes into the picture. So I would say that I don't see a love triangle there.
Okay, a lot of questions about the three.
Oh no.
But here's one more, a
Yeah.
different one.
Okay.
If androgyny is recognized in the
Yes.
Talmudic commentary,
Right.
does it impact on modern views of LGBTQ
Yes.
questions?
Yes. Okay. So the huge issue of gender in Judaism is different. So okay. Maybe let's not talk about okay, so let's talk about gender as opposed to male and female genders. Let's just talk about that a minute. It's a huge other talk in and of itself, which I was not planning on doing, which we could do for another series. But Hebrew, let's just be clear and honest with ourselves, that the whole concept of neutrality in gender, evenness in gender, fairness in gender is very difficult to talk about when we're talking about anything in Hebrew, ancient or modern Hebrew, because Hebrew by its definition is a gendered language. right? There are no neutral pronouns, no neutral nouns. So I would argue that language informs how we think and discuss things. And in fact, modern Israelis, there are groups of modern Israelis who are trying to come up with this issue right now, that people who see themselves as gender fluid or gender non-conforming who live in Israel and speak Hebrew as their mother tongue are actually in trouble because they are having trouble expressing themselves. And there are groups of people who are trying to deal with that now. That being said, that's not going to change our ancient texts. But I would say different discussions of differently gendered people, including our chapter 1, verse 27 that we talk about, can sometimes be, and other discussions in the Talmud of people that are, that see themselves or physically look differently gendered based on how they're born or whatever. Those discussions do happen in the Talmud. And I think there's two ways of looking at it. Generally, I would say that Judaism, traditional Judaism, is generally binary in almost everything. It's either good or bad, male or female, melchic or fleishik. However, there are exceptions, maybe not as many as some moderns would want, but I think some people who are looking for a more gender inclusive discussion within Judaism are at least comforted to know that these things exist in our texts. What later rabbis do with them is another story. But the idea that they exist, for some, I'm not going to tell anyone what their feelings should be, but for some, I think can provide some comfort. That's what I'm going to say about that. Oh, Carol, I lost your volume.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
This is amazing. More and more questions are coming
Oh,
in.
no.
That number 3 is really puzzling a lot of people. But I think, I think we're going to call it here, end it here, because I want to keep people excited for coming next week. I mean, this is just, personally, I want to go back to school. Just no exams, no tests or anything. Yeah. It's so interesting. But I'm just going to invite people to come back next week for more, and stay safe. And Rabbi Cutler is going to wants to say something now. Oh, and Rabbi Cutler is the person that put us in touch with you, and it's a wonderful shidduch. So thank you.
Oh, good. I'm happy.
There we go. I was just here to say thank you. Yes, I did make the shidduch when we were talking with women of Adath about what a great program would be, and talking about women in Jewish history. But I think I know someone who does a really good job with that. Let's see if I can find her phone number. Of course, I've known the Urowitz family in particular for many years. I wasn't able to catch everything today, unfortunately, but what I caught, I really enjoyed. So thank you to women of Adath. Thank you to you, Dr. Urowitz-Freudenstein, for speaking. I know everyone's really looking forward to the rest of the series. I just wanted to point out, if anyone wants to learn more about amulets, this is go-to. Jewish Magic and Superstition by Joshua Trachtenberg. Really great book. Yes. And if you're interested in the question of gender in rabbinic texts and how that's been approached, this is a year or so old by Noam Sienas, a nice Toronto boy. It's called A Rainbow Thread, an anthology of queer Jewish texts from the 1st century to 1969. A really great reader if you're interested in that kind of thing. And of course, anytime anyone teaches something, I'm like, oh, I should do a class on that. Oh, I should do a class on that. So thank you for all those ideas. I won't have time today for everything, but I'm sure this class will continue and be great. So wonderful seeing everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I look forward to next week. Everyone come on back.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. It was wonderful. And thank you, Anna, at Adath for doing all the technical piece of it. Stay safe, and we'll see everybody next week. Bye-bye.
Amazing. Bye. Thank you, everyone.